We are several months late in doing this, but I wanted to take a moment to share with the Perth USAsia Center community how excited we are to have been joined in August by our new Director of Research, Dr. Kate O'Shaughnessy. Many of you will already have had opportunity to meet Kate in person, but for those of you who are not in Perth and are joining us, are watching our programs and our research and other materials online, we wanted to sit down and have a bit of an introductory chat. So Dr. Kate O'Shaughnessy, Director of Research at the Perth USAsia Center. I'm tempted to use the American tradition of taking once a title, always a title, to add on the title of ambassador. But Kate, you've had a tremendous trajectory from Kalgoorlie to Port Louis, and Canberra and Perth in between in the Foreign Service. Why don't you just give us a little bit of a self-introduction about your career background?
Well, firstly, let me say, Gordon, what a pleasure it is to be joining you and joining the centre. It's really, I would say, the culmination of all of my interests in the world abroad, but also the world right here in Western Australia. It's the perfect combination. And to answer your question, how did I get to where I am? There's not really an easy answer. I never expected to get to the place that I am except by putting one foot in front of the other. Certainly growing up in Kalgoorlie in a pub that my parents ran to service the mining community, I never would have expected that I would go on to work in foreign policy, that I would go on to learn Indonesian and French, work in West Africa, work in Lebanon, work in France. That was as far away from my imaginings of what was possible as you could possibly imagine. The pivotal point, I would say, for me in my career journey was actually choosing at the age of 18 to learn Indonesian. And at the time, there was no reason that I decided to do that apart from the fact that I had another friend in the residential college where I was studying who had decided to enrol in that class, and it seemed like it would be a fun thing to do. That's often the case with careers. It's just a chance, a chance decision that directs everything that happens afterwards. But it was really a life-changing moment when I subsequently went on to study Indonesian in Indonesia, learn about a country that is just 4 hours flight from Perth, is so different, so dynamic, even at the time that I was there in 2000, which was just 2 years after the Asian monetary crisis and Indonesia was really suffering. But I could really see in my engagement with Indonesian people, with students at Gadjah Mada University in Yogyakarta, a real energy and a desire to engage with other people and the world. And I had never thought about that right on my doorstep. So that really set off a chain of interest in the world outside of Western Australia and a real desire to engage in it.
Well, you went on to get a PhD in Indonesian Studies here at the University of Western Australia, and then to a career with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which saw you, despite your Indonesian language and your experience in Indonesia, spent a lot of time in Europe and in Africa. Back here as the Deputy Director of our WA State Office, but then most recently, up until July, I think it was, as our High Commissioner to Mauritius and the Seychelles. Tell us a little bit more about your DFAT journey.
DFAT is really famous, and Kevin Rudd is the most famous example of people who go into the department with a particular skill. He joined the department as a good Chinese speaker. I joined the department as a pretty good Indonesian speaker in 2007. They famously send you anywhere but the place where you have a skill set. It's not exactly true because you have to apply to a list of vacancies, and at the time that I was eligible to be going overseas on my first assignment, there weren't any vacancies in Jakarta, but there was a vacancy in Accra in Ghana in West Africa that had been very hard to fill. I beat one other person for that job, but it actually turned out to be a really rewarding role because it coincided with our campaign for the UN Security Council seat between 2009 and 2012. While I thought at the time, and I still think, that West Africa is obviously not at the centre of our foreign policy interests, it's not a bad thing as a young diplomat to learn about multilateral campaigns and how we engage on the world stage. So that was a fabulous first posting. I travelled around the entirety of the region, 9 countries covered from Ghana and a number of other countries anyway, because I was in the region. That then led to a rather niche position in the department, which was someone who had some expertise and interest in Africa, and led to some time at the Office of National Assessments while we were on the UN Security Council. Some really interesting work on a kidnap response task force in West Africa a few years later, which led to some time in France, and ultimately, as now an Africa expert, as High Commissioner to the Republic of Mauritius, as well as Seychelles, Madagascar and Comoros, which was a really fabulous way to end a career.
You also were here, and we first had a chance to meet when you were Deputy Director of the Department of what we call the Embassy to Western Australia, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Office here in WA. That was a bit of a homecoming. I'd like your reflections on your time overseas and your time doing international relations, and then bringing them back to your home state, to Western Australia.
It was a really interesting role working at the DFAT office in Perth, because you are kind of an ambassador for Western Australia back to Canberra, explaining to your colleagues and to ministers' offices what WA has to offer to the Australian story overseas. And that's an important part of our international engagement that's not always fully understood by counterparts, not, I think, through any willful ignorance, but just a fact of distance. So there was that part. And then there was also kind of a part where you're an ambassador for the Commonwealth back into your own state, because people feel really strongly here Canberra's not understanding what we want to do. But of course, Canberra is an amalgam of all sorts of people, including people like me that are from Western Australia and do really care what Western Australia has to offer. So it was a bit of an explainer role, mediating between the two sides, and I really enjoyed that.
You know, both when you were in the office and even today, we just over the weekend had the great fortune of having the Japanese Prime Minister meet with our Prime Minister here in Western Australia. We tend to, given the international focus of the Perth USAsia Centre, see the DFAT office here as our liaison, our primary point of contact, because we work so well together, bringing people to WA and taking WA to the region. So I appreciate your role then. Look, I think if I recall correctly, your very first week on the job, we had this massive Indian Ocean Defence and Security Conference. And while we were there, we had a chance to brief Professor Stephen Smith, who serves on our board, and Sir Angus Houston, the two of together who are leading the National Defence Strategic Review. And despite all our great ideas, they were keenly focused on you, because you had a unique perspective from Mauritius and the Seychelles, looking at the Indian Ocean. Just last week, you and I were together in Delhi, where again, we were calling upon your unique perspective in small states in the Indian Ocean. I wonder if you might kind of share 2 or 3 of the real takeaways you had from that experience that should be relevant to us looking at the Indian Ocean from Western Australia.
So I think the first point to say about that is that, of course, Australia has interests in the Indian Ocean, and traditionally policymakers think about the Indian Ocean right up to the northeastern border, if you like. And I think overall that's the right way to look at it. But if you go further west, countries like India have very critical interests in that part of the Indian Ocean. They see the Western Indian Ocean, which takes in countries like Mauritius, Seychelles, Madagascar and Comoros, as very much their backyard and critical to their own national security. At the same time, we're seeing the same sorts of geopolitical competition between big powers like India and China that we're seeing in the Pacific. But because it's so far away from our interests, we don't necessarily think about it. If we are thinking about working with big partners like India, we do need to understand their perspectives. They're not always going to be the same as ours, but they will have priorities that we need to take account of, because we also want India to take account of our priorities in further afield places like the Pacific. So that's the first point that I would make. The second point that I would make is around Chinese engagement in that part of the world. It's quite well understood that China's established a military base in Djibouti on the east coast of Africa, and that forms part of a chain of bases and interests that they want to link up. I'm not sure if we've made the prediction at a policy level about what that might look like in 10 or 20 or 30 years. So if I was still sitting in government and talking about the Indian Ocean, I would probably be saying to counterparts, It's right that we're thinking more about the Pacific right now than elsewhere, but we should also be thinking about the possibilities, whether it's far-fetched or not, of hard military conflict in the Indian Ocean, because that could be a scenario that comes about.
We at the Centre like to make much of the fact that we're Australia's Indian Ocean capital, and as you've seen in your first couple of months, having an understanding that the Indian Ocean is more than just India, that there's an awful lot going on in the region, and the other states have vested interest in the region. It's really, really helpful. But I actually want to turn to our near neighbor and kind of look forward a little bit now, Indonesia. You had an academic foundation in Indonesian Studies, and now an opportunity with the Perth USAsia Centre to look forward to it. I don't think either of us have been to Jakarta now for 3 years at least with COVID, but we've got an upcoming trip in November. The Perth USAsia Centre is actively supportive of the foreign policy community of Indonesia. I think by the time this interview airs, there will have been a global town hall, which we support, and we're looking forward to being in Jakarta to support their conference on Indonesian foreign policy. I'm curious, you've already talked about what was interesting for you in Indonesia 20 years ago. What do you see coming down the pike? What are the trends? What are the developments? What are the priorities that you're going to have as our Director of Research and as somebody who's kind of leading our effort on Indonesia going forward?
Firstly, to put an overarching framework around all of that, I am enormously enthusiastic about working on Indonesia, and so that, I think, will infuse everything I do with the centre. I really am looking forward to my first visit to Jakarta in many, many years later this month. Capturing some of that enthusiasm in Indonesia about its place in the world and its economic future, and helping the Australian policy and business community understand that, I think, is a really important role that our centre can play. We all know the figures, that Indonesia is the fourth most populous nation, that it will be the fourth biggest economy by 2050. It's likely to overtake the size of the Australian economy by the end of this decade. So the opportunities are extraordinary, but at the same time, the competition is extraordinary as well. Australia is not the only player in Indonesia by a long shot. So really helping our business and government counterparts really nail down what are the specific opportunities that are most suited to Australia will be important, and I'm excited about doing that. The second thing that I'm really excited about doing, and I think it's a task that those in the Indonesia community have been seized of for the last couple of decades, and it's still a task that we need to work on, is helping Australians and Indonesians understand each other better. Because although in the policy community we talk about that as an important issue, it's still an unfinished job and something that we need to really, really work on.
Well, we were delighted to have you be part of the state government-led Indonesia Connect event just this last Friday. And I'm glad that you're heading up to Darwin for the Australia-Indonesia Business Council national meeting. So it's good for us to have a voice and a role in that. Look, I think as an audience, you can see why we're so excited to have Kate on board. Her own expertise, plus her international experience and her leadership to help our broader research team kind of move forward on these issues. I want to wrap up the interview by bringing it back home a little bit. WA has a new tourism slogan. That's WA like no other. Well, you're from Kalgoorlie. People in Perth will know Kalgoorlie. My guess is people over east will not, and certainly people in the region will not. Tell us a little bit more about your hometown and where you're from in that regard.
I don't know that Kalgoorlie has changed enormously since I grew up there in the 70s and 80s. It's 600 kilometres from Perth, pretty much in a straight line. It's in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by red dirt, desert, not much water. You get water from a pipe that was built in the early 1900s from Perth, from Mundaring Weir, to give you a sense of how difficult it is to live there. It wasn't really the kind of place that would encourage a career in international affairs just because of its isolation. It, of course, has a long history of migration, people coming from all sorts of countries to work in the mining industry there. But really, I would say a self-contained and isolated sort of place. I love it and still love it, and have found over the course of my career I've often lived near beautiful beaches or in beautiful cities, but actually the place where I feel happiest is in dirty outback red dirt bush sort of scenario. So I think that's been really rooted deeply in my psyche.
Look, hearing you speak, I think people will understand something that I've observed over time. You're so clear in your articulation of issues, and part of that comes from, I myself am from Window Rock, Arizona, not red dirt, but also big towering red sandstone cliffs, and that's home. Those are this small little town on the Navajo Nation in the middle of Arizona. But as you grow up somewhere like that, you learn to kind of speak relatively clearly without all the fuffery, is that a word, that might come around foreign policy. And so I, myself, and my wife, we last year on this time decided we needed a romantic vacation. So we drove along that C.Y. O'Connor pipeline and toured all the museums and spent 3 glorious days in Kalgoorlie. So we're glad and we're appreciative to Kalgoorlie for our new director of research. And thank you for taking the time to introduce it. So on behalf of the Perth USAsia Center, we look forward to engaging with you more directly going forward and having as part of our team in doing that, Dr. Kate O'Shaughnessy. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks, Gordon.